In this rare photo from the set of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance 1962, Lee Van Cleef is seen with Lee Marvin, James Stewart, and John Wayne. This photo captures a rare moment where these Western film legends shared the screen. Off-screen, however, their relationship was anything but collegial. Rumors and recollections from Hollywood history suggest that Lee Van Cleef harbored a deep dislike for John Wayne. Let's take a look into the facts and context behind that alleged animosity. We'll examine how their careers, political ideologies, personal experiences, and even mentors like director John Ford set these two men on a collision course. John Wayne was the undisputed king of Hollywood westerns for decades. Towering in popularity and physical stature, Duke Wayne came to symbolize the classic Old West hero, tough, principled, and ready to draw his six-shooters to defend American ideals. By the 1960s, Wayne's name was practically synonymous with the Western genre. Lee Van Cleef, by contrast, had a very different trajectory. He started as a peripheral villain in 1950s westerns, recognizable for his hawk-like features and piercing gaze. After years of minor roles, Van Cleef achieved worldwide fame in the mid-1960s thanks to spaghetti westerns, the stylish, violent western films shot in Europe, notably those directed by Sergio Leone. Where Wayne embodied the traditional white hat hero, Van Cleef often personified the ruthless outlaw or anti-hero. These contrasting screen personas already hint at tension, the all-American good guy versus the menacing gunslinger. But it was behind the scenes in the real-world beliefs and experiences of the two actors that a genuine rift developed. Divergent paths and first encounters. To understand the bad blood, it's crucial to compare Van Cleef's and Wayne's early lives and careers. John Wayne, born Marion Morrison in 1907, became a star in the 1930s under director John Ford and others, skyrocketing with films like Stagecoach 1939. During World War II, Wayne famously did not serve in the military, instead continuing to make movies as his contribution to morale. In later years, he was occasionally criticized for effectively avoiding combat while projecting a war hero image on screen. Lee Van Cleef's life took the opposite turn in WW2. At age 17, Van Cleef enlisted in the U.S. Navy to fight in World War II. He served as a sonarman on a minesweeper in both European and Pacific theaters and earned a Bronze Star for bravery in combat. By war's end, Van Cleef had literally put his life on the line for his country. This fundamental difference, a real veteran versus a Hollywood warrior, would later feed into the ideological gulf between them. As one film historian put it, Wayne was a fiercely conservative patriot in rhetoric, but famously avoided any kind of military service, a fact that made much of his chestiness hollow to those who knew the truth. Van Cleef, on the other hand, embodied wartime sacrifice in reality without needing to boast. After the war, Van Cleef turned to acting, starting on stage and then in Hollywood. His very first film role was small but significant. He played one of the outlaw henchmen in High Noon, 1952. Though he had no lines in that film, director Fred Zinnemann reportedly cut Van Cleef's single line, leaving him a purely visual presence. It was an auspicious debut in a Best Picture-winning Western. High Noon would soon become a flashpoint in the Wayne Van Cleef saga. The film's writer, Carl Foreman, had been blacklisted as an alleged communist sympathizer during the Red Scare, and wrote High Noon as an allegory about cowardice and conscience in Hollywood. John Wayne, a vehement anti-communist, hated High Noon and everything it stood for. Wayne refused the lead role, which went to Gary Cooper, because he felt Foreman's story was a thinly veiled critique of blacklisting, a practice Wayne ardently supported. In fact, Wayne later bragged, "I'll never regret having helped run Foreman out of the country." Foreman indeed had to exile himself to London due to the blacklist. Furthermore, Wayne declared High Noon the most un-American thing I've ever seen, condemning its message that ordinary citizens might abandon their protector in a time of crisis. Consider what that meant for Van Cleef. The young actor's very first movie was one that John Wayne publicly trashed as un-American. Wayne even teamed up with director Howard Hawks to make Rio Bravo, 1959, as a conservative answer to High Noon's perceived unpatriotic tone. It's easy to imagine that Van Cleef took note of Wayne's stance. In the early 1950s, Van Cleef was just a bit part player without a platform to voice opinions, but he was quietly aligning with people like Foreman, whether by ideology or by happenstance of casting. This was the first seed of discord. Van Cleef's career was touched by a film that Wayne despised on principle. The stage was set for personal antipathy. Another early intersection of their paths came in 1956 on the set of The Conqueror. This ill-fated historical epic starred John Wayne, bizarrely cast as Genghis Khan, and featured Lee Van Cleef in a supporting role as one of Khan's brothers. Filming took place in the Utah desert, downwind of a U.S. nuclear test site, a choice that proved disastrous. Unbeknownst to the crew, the location had been irradiated by fallout from atomic tests. They spent weeks kicking up radioactive dust. The result, revealed years later, was chilling. Of the 220 cast and crew, 91 developed cancer in their lifetimes, far above average expectation. By 1980, 46 people from the film had died of cancer, including Wayne, the director Dick Powell, and co-stars Susan Hayward and Agnes Moorehead. Pedro Armendariz, another co-star, took his own life after a terminal cancer diagnosis. This tragedy would contribute to Van Cleef's feelings about Wayne. Why? Because Wayne was the marquee star of The Conqueror and a close friend of the producer, Howard Hughes. When the cancer cluster became known, Wayne defended the government's nuclear tests and downplayed any connection. In a 1970s interview, Wayne argued that smoking, not radiation, was the likely cause of the cancers despite evidence to the contrary, and went so far as to justify U.S. nuclear testing as a necessary measure against the Soviet threat. Clashing ideologies and personal values. Ideology was a central factor in the Van Cleef-Wayne rift. John Wayne was not just a movie star, he was a walking symbol of a certain American conservative ethos. He served as president of the right-wing Motion Picture Alliance for a time and was an outspoken supporter of anti-communist efforts in Hollywood. He championed American exceptionalism, traditional patriotism, and later in the 1960s, a hardline pro-war stance at the height of the Vietnam conflict. Wayne even produced and co-directed the Green Berets' 1968, essentially a piece of Vietnam War propaganda reflecting his unwavering support for the U.S. military. In interviews, he could be blunt about his views. The famous 1971 Playboy interview revealed Wayne's intolerant side on multiple issues, which alienated many younger and more liberal colleagues. In short, John Wayne was ultra-conservative, pro-military, and unafraid to broadcast it. Lee Van Cleef's political profile, in contrast, was far more low-key. He was not known to blast opinions from a podium, nor was he associated with activist groups in Hollywood. By many accounts, Van Cleef leaned more moderate or even liberal in private. It's important not to exaggerate this. He wasn't a prominent political voice. However, consider his background and circle. Van Cleef worked comfortably in Europe in the 1960s, at a time when many American conservatives, including Wayne, sneered at those European spaghetti westerns for their violence and cynicism. Van Cleef also got along with people who were anathema to Wayne's ideology, for instance. High Noon's Carl Foreman, or liberal actors like Henry Fonda, with whom Van Cleef worked in Rawhide and other projects. Van Cleef's wartime service also perhaps made him less glorifying of war. Unlike Wayne, who saw war as a place to project heroism, Van Cleef had seen the real thing, mines and all, and didn't romanticize it. One illustrative anecdote of their ideological divide involves a generational dispute over westerns. By the late 1960s, a new kind of western film had risen, darker, morally ambiguous, sometimes outright revisionist about American history. Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy, in which Van Cleef co-starred, and Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch are prime examples. These films were more violent and critical of the mythic West. John Wayne absolutely loathed this trend. He felt these movies dishonored the legacy of the frontier and the heroes of American expansion. This came to a head in the early 1970s when Wayne watched Clint Eastwood's High Plains Drifter 1973, a surreal, revenge-driven western that couldn't be further from a classic John Ford odor. Wayne was so disturbed by it that he wrote Eastwood a personal letter expressing his disgust. According to Eastwood, Wayne complained that isn't what the West was all about. That isn't the American people who settled this country. In Wayne's view, Eastwood, and by implication Leone, Peckinpah, and actors like Van Cleef were painting the Old West in a distorted, overly negative light. Eastwood, for his part, recognized that Wayne simply came from a different generation and mindset. But imagine how Lee Van Cleef, whose bread and butter was the gritty spaghetti western, would respond internally to Wayne's pronouncement. Wayne's letter essentially maligned the very films that had resurrected Van Cleef's career and made him a star. Indeed, Van Cleef's signature roles as the coolly sadistic Colonel Mortimer in For a Few Dollars More and the ruthless angel eyes in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly were paradigms of the anti-heroic Western Wayne decried. Wayne's stance was that such films were unpatriotic and historically false. Van Cleef, by contrast, likely felt that these films told hard truths about violence and greed on the frontier, or at least he was happy to be part of them. As film writer Jeremy Smith noted, Wayne got proprietary about the Western genre and took it upon himself to police its direction. Van Cleef's success in the late 60s was, from Wayne's perspective, part of a troubling new direction in Westerns. This put them fundamentally at odds as artists. On a personal value level, there was also the matter of integrity and hypocrisy. Wayne loudly wrapped himself in the flag and the cowboy mythos, yet he had, in Van Cleef's eyes, sat out the real fights. It's on record that director John Ford, a mentor to Wayne, would occasionally needle Wayne about his lack of war service, precisely because so many others, including Ford himself, had served. Van Cleef, as a veteran, could well have shared that private contempt. In fact, one modern commentator speculated, perhaps if Wayne had served in World War II, he'd have developed a finer appreciation for the capacity for evil in the world, instead of clinging to sanitized heroics. That line pointedly contrasts Wayne's idealism with the more sobering outlook of folks who'd seen combat. While we don't have a direct quote from Van Cleef saying this, it resonates with what we know of their backgrounds. In short, Van Cleef likely saw Wayne as a patriotic blusterer who hadn't paid the same dues, a man quick to celebrate war on screen, but absent from the real one. This kind of implicit judgment often festers quietly in Hollywood circles. Finally, it's worth noting that Van Cleef had a softer, humane side off screen that didn't mesh with Wayne's hardline persona. Van Cleef was described by colleagues as a polite, introverted man who loved animals and painting in his spare time. He wasn't the type to get on a soapbox about politics. Wayne, on the other hand, was gregarious, domineering, and inclined to issue proclamations about what's American. Personality-wise, they just didn't mix. One was a quiet professional, the other, an outspoken icon who could come off as a bully. Hollywood hierarchies and the John Ford factor. No story of John Wayne is complete without John Ford, the legendary director who shaped Wayne's career. Ford's presence looms large in the backdrop of the Wayne-Van Cleef dynamic, and indeed Ford's treatment of both men is telling. As mentioned, Ford took Wayne from B-movie obscurity 8-day westerns, as Ford put it, and made him a star in Stagecoach. The two had a complicated, almost father-son relationship. Ford was a genius filmmaker, but also a notorious taskmaster who could be cruel to cast and crew. He especially loved to ride John Wayne, perhaps to keep Wayne humble or perhaps out of his own insecurities. By the time Lee Van Cleef came onto Ford's radar, the director was in his late career and even more irascible. The one film set where Van Cleef and Wayne directly interacted was Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, shot in 1961 and released in 1962. Van Cleef won the small role of Reese, one of the henchmen of the villain Liberty Valance played by Lee Marvin. Wayne was top billed alongside James Stewart. This production turned out to be infamously tense, largely due to John Ford's behavior, and it provides a vivid snapshot of how Van Cleef might have solidified his disdain for Wayne and the old guard. According to multiple accounts and Van Cleef's own later recollections, John Ford resented the studio's interference on Liberty Valance. Paramount Pictures insisted that Wayne be cast to boost the box office, essentially telling Ford he couldn't make the movie without the Duke. Ford agreed, but he was not happy about it. He didn't want Wayne thinking he'd done him a favor by giving him the role. So, once production began, Ford took out his bruised ego on Wayne. Lee Van Cleef witnessed this firsthand on set. Ford relentlessly taunted and belittled John Wayne throughout the shoot. As Van Cleef later recounted, Ford was a complete bastard to Wayne. He'd abuse him and swear at him and call him a goddamn lousy actor. Ford seemed intent on humiliating the guy who got him the job of making that film. This is a direct quote from Van Cleef, who was on that set mostly as a bystander to the heavyweight drama between director and star. Moreover, Ford showed no particular affection for Van Cleef either. As a newcomer on a Ford set, Van Cleef was just another tool to be used. He had a few lines at most, and Ford never employed him again after Liberty Valance. In contrast, Ford doted on his favorites, Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, and others, even as he abused them. Van Cleef was an outsider to this club. Years later, he remembered that he never did become one of Wayne's in crowd, on set or off, implying that he was excluded from the camaraderie and perks that Wayne and the Ford stock company enjoyed. In a 1978 interview, Van Cleef diplomatically said of Wayne, "It was hard not to like him. He was never less than professional. But reading between the lines, Van Cleef places Wayne as a somewhat distant figure, courteous on set, sure, yet hardly a friend. And Van Cleef's praise is faint, noting that Wayne knew as much about making movies as anyone, and did his job even under Ford's abuse. It's respect for Wayne's professionalism, but not warmth for Wayne as a person. We can sense an undercurrent. Van Cleef admired Wayne's industry know-how, even as he likely disdained Wayne's grandstanding and deference to a tyrant like Ford. Anecdotes of hatred. Beyond differences in worldview and isolated on-set observations, is there evidence that Lee Van Cleef actively despised John Wayne? In Hollywood's oral history, yes, several anecdotes and third-party recollections explicitly claim Van Cleef hated or couldn't stand Wayne. It's important to note that Van Cleef himself rarely bad-mouthed colleagues on record. However, those close to him and subsequent researchers have pieced together a narrative that Van Cleef harbored a grudge for years. One oft-cited claim is that Van Cleef hated Wayne more than anyone else in Hollywood, not out of envy nor over a stolen role, but due to fundamental differences in character. This strong language comes from retrospective sources that likely draw on interviews or conversations now lost. The absence of a direct published interview where Van Cleef says, "I despise John Wayne," means we rely on the consistency of various reports, and indeed multiple sources converge on the idea that Van Cleef's dislike was real. Consider the social context. Hollywood in the 1960s and 70s had its share of public clashes and cold shoulders. John Wayne, for instance, had a notorious encounter with Frank Sinatra. Wayne and Sinatra nearly brawled at a charity benefit in 1974 over political insults. Sinatra, a liberal, came dressed as a Native American to a Western-themed event and butted heads with Wayne until others intervened. Some retellings of this incident have mistakenly attached Lee Van Cleef's name, perhaps due to confusion or conflation. In reality, the documented near altercation was with Sinatra, but it reveals that Wayne was not shy about mixing it up when provoked. If Van Cleef had ever confronted Wayne in a similar manner, sparks would have flown. There is one unconfirmed story that the two men nearly came to blows at a Hollywood event, possibly the same benefit. The TikTok-era summary of Hollywood feuds claims the two reportedly nearly got into a physical altercation at a Hollywood benefit show. Without solid citation, we must treat this as rumor, yet it aligns with Wayne's known temper and Van Cleef's known grudge. It's entirely plausible that Van Cleef, seeing Wayne at a function, might have exchanged harsh words, especially if alcohol was involved. Wayne enjoyed his whiskey, and Van Cleef was no stranger to a drink either. If such an incident did occur, it has survived only in second-hand recollections rather than newspaper headlines. What we do have in the record is Van Cleef's pattern of commentary and life choices that reflect his disdain. For example, Van Cleef chose to build his stardom in Europe during the mid-60s, rather than kowtow to the Hollywood establishment that orbited around stars like Wayne. This was a bold move at the time. It signaled that Van Cleef didn't need Hollywood's approval where Wayne was king. He could become an international star on his own terms. When he returned to Hollywood in the 1970s, Van Cleef still never worked with John Wayne. It's hard to imagine Wayne would have welcomed him as a co-star. Wayne was known to prefer certain actors. He often cast the same faces in his own productions and avoided those he clashed with. For instance, Wayne and Clint Eastwood never made a film together. Wayne even turned down a chance to co-star with Eastwood in the mid-70s because he hated the script's anti-hero tone. By the same token, Wayne likely had no interest in working with Van Cleef, a poster child for the new Western. The feeling was mutual. Van Cleef's family and friends have hinted at his low opinion of Wayne as well. After Van Cleef's death in 1989, some anecdotes emerged that he would bristle at the mention of Wayne's name or roll his eyes when Wayne was lauded. One reason often given is that Van Cleef resented the hero worship of Wayne, considering it undeserved. To Van Cleef, men like Audie Murphy, a real WW2 hero-turned-actor, or Jimmy Stewart, who flew combat missions, were far more worthy of respect if one was admiring war heroes on screen. Wayne, in Van Cleef's eyes, was a bit of a phony, a man who pretended to be the toughest American on screen but sat out actual danger. That sentiment, John Wayne was a coward, has been expressed by others in Hollywood as well, usually privately. It's not hard to believe Van Cleef shared it. Another facet was personal slights. Van Cleef spent much of the 1950s playing heavies who inevitably lost to the square-jawed hero the archetype Wayne embodied. It's conceivable that Van Cleef grew tired of the Western formula that always exalted the white hat. Wayne, as the ultimate white hat hero, represented an entire system that typecast and underpaid actors like Van Cleef. It wasn't until European directors broke that mold that Van Cleef got to be on equal footing as a lead. So there's a professional bitterness. Wayne and his generation's westerns kept Van Cleef in the margins. Additionally, John Wayne was known to be cordial but distant with actors outside his clique. Van Cleef was never invited into Wayne's social circle, which included pals like Ward Bond, Maureen O'Hara, etc. If their paths crossed at industry gatherings, any conversation might have been strained. Wayne could be gruff and politically provocative in conversation. Van Cleef, if more soft-spoken, might have quietly seethed or disengaged. One illuminating quote comes again from Van Cleef via biographer Michael Munn. Speaking retrospectively about Wayne on The Conqueror, Van Cleef noted Wayne was out of his depth as Genghis Khan, but never less than professional. He also recounted how actress Susan Hayward flirted with Wayne on that film and couldn't understand why Wayne, a married man, rebuffed her advances. Van Cleef observed it all with a bit of amusement. In these recollections, you can sense Van Cleef's underlying critique of Wayne. He implies Wayne was miscast, hence out of his depth, and he highlights Wayne's polite rejection of Hayward as an example of Wayne's courtesy. It's measured praise, but one could read a touch of sarcasm as if Van Cleef is saying he was a decent guy but clearly not suited for everything he tried to be. This aligns with Van Cleef's broader view. Wayne was propped up as a hero and even as a pseudo-warrior in films like The Green Berets or ill-advised roles like Genghis Khan, yet those who really knew the craft or the history could see through it. By the time John Wayne passed away in 1979 and Lee Van Cleef in 1989, the two men had left indelible but very different marks on cinema. Their apparent feud was never the tabloid fodder type. It smoldered in the background, known to insiders and discernible through their work and words. Historically, the clash between Van Cleef and Wayne symbolizes a turning point in Western film. It was the collision of the old Hollywood mythology with a more critical, worldly perspective that emerged in the 1960s. In the end, their story adds a human dimension to the study of Hollywood's golden age versus new age. It reminds us that the cowboys on screen had their own showdowns off screen, fought not with six guns, but with principles and pride. Van Cleef versus Wayne was a quiet duel, a clash of respect versus resentment, tradition versus transition. Both men went to their graves without publicly reconciling these differences. Thank you for watching. Lee Van Cleef's story reminds us that beneath the swagger of Western stardom lay bruised pride, bruised egos, and bitter truths. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Hollywood's hidden tensions, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Who else do you think harbored silent rivalries in old Hollywood? Let us know, and we may cover it next. Until then, keep the legends alive.